Switzerland. Today it's cheese, watches, and neutrality. Back then, less about clocks ticking and more about beds creaking. Forget mountains and lakes. Half the scandal was what people were doing in the valleys after dark. Smash subscribe like a Swiss hammer hitting church bells. And tell me, where are you watching from? Midnight mischief or a boring office lunch break? The Swiss Confederation might look wholesome in postcards, but peel back the Alpine innocence and you'll find scandals so wild they'd make even Netflix blush. We're talking peasants, priests, mercenaries, and trust me, the cheese wasn't the only thing aging in cellars. Take the mercenaries. Hired out across Europe like the medieval version of a premium subscription service, these men brought back more than coin. Taverns whispered about foreign tricks they picked up in France and Italy, which didn't involve swordplay. A pamphlet from Zurich sneered, "Our sons return with gold on their belts and fire in their loins." Translation, STDs were the true import-export business. And then there was the church. Priests preached chastity from the pulpit while keeping mistresses tucked in chalets. One notorious satire described a bishop's quarters as a monastery with extra moans. Parish gossip spread faster than communion wine, especially when illegitimate children looked suspiciously like their confessors. Meanwhile, rural festivals became infamous. Think less wholesome folk dance and more 16th century frat party. Villagers donned masks, drank until goats looked attractive, and invented games that involved more touching than theology. Outsiders were horrified. Insiders, they called it tradition. One sarcastic pamphlet even advertised, "Join us at harvest, bring wine, leave shame." But the most dangerous practices weren't the drunken hookups, it was the secret societies. Swiss men swore oaths in candlelit barns, mixing politics with rituals that were one part brotherhood, two part bachelor party. Pamphlets accused them of naked ceremonies, though whether it was symbolic or just another excuse to undress, history refuses to clarify. Convenient, isn't it? Every 40 seconds, the Confederation offered a new scandal. One minute a soldier sneaking off with a courtesan, next a noble family fighting over who got to inherit not land but mistresses. Satirists had a field day. They drew woodcuts of men with swords in one hand and something else in the other. Subtlety was never Switzerland's strength. Even the reputation for neutrality came under attack. A French pamphlet mocked they refused to take sides in war but never refuse a bed. Ouch. Diplomacy might have been measured, but the bedroom, anything but neutral. And yet, despite endless scandals, Swiss society marched on. Cheese kept aging, mercenaries kept marching, and priests kept pretending. The danger was never just in the acts themselves, it was in the hypocrisy. The bigger the sermons, the darker the secrets. So yes, Switzerland might have looked calm on the surface, but underneath the Alps was a whole avalanche of scandal. And in the next part, we'll dig into the mercenaries' dirtiest exports, the ones Europe never wanted in writing. If you thought the Swiss were scandalous only when swinging swords abroad, wait till you hear what they got up to in their own valleys. Neutrality might have been their political export, but in the bedroom they were waging wars no treaty could stop. Take the village festivals. Officially, these were pious harvest celebrations. Unofficially, think Coachella without the music, but with twice the liquor. Drunken haystack encounters became so routine that pamphleteers joked about annual sowing of both seed and sin. Parents pretended to scold, but half the village was conceived during those same festivals. And then came the masked carnivals, imported from Venice but given a Swiss twist. A cowbell and a shepherd's cloak became as effective as a Venetian mask. The anonymity gave villagers license to behave badly. You didn't know if you were dancing with your neighbor, your cousin, or the pastor's daughter. And that was exactly the point. Satirists had a field day. One engraving showed a priest delivering a sermon while masked dancers cavorted right outside the church window. The caption read, "He preaches restraint, but the flock prefers revelry." Irony was practically a national sport. It wasn't just youth. Married women whose husbands spent years abroad as mercenaries developed reputations of their own. Loneliness mixed with alpine boredom made for some creative companionships. A goat herder or passing peddler might find himself promoted to temporary husband. Pamphlets warned the soldier returns to find his cradle not empty but fuller than he left it. The hypocrisy reached the courts too. Judges condemned adultery in public hearings, then hosted feasts in private where the rules were conveniently forgotten. One pamphlet showed a magistrate with a gavel in one end and a courtesan on his lap. Justice, Swiss style. Meanwhile, gossip wasn't just verbal, it was performative. Tavern songs included scandalous verses about local affairs. Imagine karaoke night, except the lyrics accused the blacksmith's wife of entertaining more than just customers. People laughed, the accused blushed, but nobody sued because next week's verse might be about someone else. What kept this cycle going was the Swiss obsession with appearing moral while practicing the opposite. The Reformation made the country stricter in theory, but in practice, it just produced better satire. The stricter the rules, the sharper the pamphlets. And the more pamphlets, the more scandals spread like wildfire.
And let's not forget the mercenary connection again. With men absent for years, foreign habits trickled into Swiss villages through letters, songs, and coin. Imported wine, imported diseases, and imported ideas about pleasure. The result? A culture that preached austerity yet lived like a never-ending tavern play. So yes, neutrality worked for politics, but for the bedroom, Switzerland was anything but neutral. It was chaotic, experimental, and gloriously hypocritical. The Swiss might have built their reputation on banking and neutrality, but their real deposits were made in haystacks, and trust me, those accounts had plenty of interest. By the late 15th century, Swiss scandals weren't confined to barns and taverns. They were climbing the social ladder right into the guild halls and council chambers. Respectable citizens loved to present themselves as paragons of discipline, yet behind closed doors, discipline often gave way to indulgence. Guild feasts were the worst-kept secret in town. Publicly, they were gatherings of merchants and craftsmen, devoted to brotherhood and civic pride. Privately, think proto-brothels, disguised as guest inns. Officially, they were meant to house travelers. Unofficially, they were subscription services centuries before Netflix. A coin at the door gave you access not to a bed, but to hospitality tailored to your tastes. Travelers spread the word, and soon these houses were more famous than the monasteries. The irony? City statutes punished prostitution harshly, sometimes with public humiliation. Yet the same counselors who enforced the laws kept secret accounts in those houses. The hypocrisy was so blatant that one satire showed a judge sentencing a courtesan by day, then sneaking into her room by night. Another layer of scandal came from traveling minstrels. They weren't just entertainers, they were gossip couriers. With a lute and a smirk, they spread tales from one canton to the next. Imagine Twitter, but slower and with better rhymes. Songs accused merchants of keeping mistresses, priests of fathering children, and wives of welcoming mercenaries. By the time the song reached the next town, everyone knew the scandal, sometimes exaggerated beyond recognition, sometimes painfully accurate. Swiss society functioned like this balancing act. Harsh moral codes on paper, wild indulgence in practice, and endless satire in between. Every time a law grew stricter, pamphleteers sharpened their pens and singers tuned their lutes. What resulted was a constant tug-of-war between morality and mockery. And let's not forget the mercenary paychecks flowing back into villages. With silver came luxuries, imported wine, silk ribbons, perfumes. These luxuries often ended up as gifts to secret lovers rather than wives. Imagine a woman parading down a cobblestone street with Venetian lace while her husband is still away in Milan. People didn't need Instagram to spot who was being spoiled. The scandals became so normalized that foreigners began to comment. One Italian traveler remarked that the Swiss were pious in prayer but pagan in appetite. Another French writer described Swiss villages as churches by morning, carnivals by night.
For once, satire and truth were indistinguishable. By the eve of the Reformation, Switzerland's reputation was a contradiction wrapped in an alpine cloak. Strict, disciplined, outwardly devout, but underneath, pulsing with stories that no amount of neutrality could bury. So yes, the guildmasters weighed gold by day and pleasures by night, proving once again that Switzerland's real export wasn't neutrality, it was double standards, packaged with a smile. By the dawn of the 16th century, Switzerland's scandals had developed a professional flair. What once belonged to village barns and guild halls now spilled into politics, diplomacy, and even battlefield reputations. Mercenary captains, celebrated for their discipline abroad, were notorious for chaos at home. Picture it. Columns of Swiss soldiers marching with military precision, but the moment wages hit their purses, order dissolved into taverns, gambling dens, and what polite records coyly called houses of refreshment. Foreign ambassadors complained that Swiss troops fought like lions by day, but prowled like cats by night. Cats, of course, with very particular appetites. Satirical pamphlets thrived on these contradictions. One lampoon showed a captain kneeling at mass while two courtesans peeked from his tent. The caption read, "Our faith may be steadfast, but our bedposts wobble." The fact that this circulated openly tells you how much appetite there was for scandal. Meanwhile, merchant elites were not to be outdone. They hired tutors from Italy, not just to teach their children, but often to entertain the wives. Swiss households developed a reputation for their Italian influence, a phrase whispered with knowing smirks. Caricatures depicted women draped in Venetian silks, leaning a little too close to dark-haired tutors over Latin text.
Even rural cantons had their peculiarities. Cattle fairs, already rowdy with drink, became infamous for what contemporary sermons condemned as beastly masquerades. Masks, music, and drunken dances blurred into behavior that polite society pretended not to notice. Pamphlets accused these fairs of being more bacchanal than marketplace, though attendance never dwindled. Religious authorities tried to rein it in. Fines were introduced, sermons thundered against the corruption of youth, and public shaming rituals paraded fallen women through the streets. But hypocrisy was the rule. The same priests enforcing chastity were whispered to keep mistresses tucked away in alpine chalets. The irony was so sharp that even Protestant reformers later mocked them, calling Switzerland a land where holiness is sung, but rarely practiced. The gossip didn't stay local. Travelers carried it across Europe. French envoys chuckled in letters about Swiss banquet excesses. Italian traders filled their diaries with tales of rustic scandals. By the mid-1500s, Switzerland had two reputations: the fierce mercenary abroad and the scandal-prone villager at home. Both were exaggerated, but both contained inconvenient truths. And here's the kicker. Scandal was never just personal, it was political currency. Pamphlets mocking a captain's affairs weren't just jokes, they were tools for rivals. Gossip about a merchant's wife wasn't idle chatter, it was leverage in council debates. Sex and politics were intertwined like vines around an alpine cottage. By the late Renaissance, Switzerland had mastered the art of scandal. They couldn't rival Italy's courtesan poets or France's libertine salons, but they didn't need to. Theirs was a uniquely alpine blend, austere on the surface, indulgent beneath, and always ready to laugh at its own double standards. So yes, the Swiss exported soldiers and watches, but their best-kept trade? Hypocrisy, polished as finely as a Bernese timepiece. The Swiss like to call themselves God's chosen guardians of the mountains. But step inside their guild halls after dark, and you'd think you'd wandered into a medieval version of Las Vegas, without the slot machines, but with twice the dice and triple the scandals. Picture a society where piety was preached from every pulpit, but the same hands that clasped in prayer by day were rolling bones over tavern tables by night. Gambling wasn't just a pastime, it was practically an Olympic sport. Whole fortunes, herds, and reputations evaporated in the clatter of dice cups. And yes, imagine losing your family cow because you couldn't resist just one more throw. That's not a metaphor, that was Tuesday in Zurich. The pamphlets had a field day. One called it Satan's Lottery. Another joked that if the Virgin Mary wanted to intercede, she'd need to learn card counting. And caricatures? Oh, they drew priests sneaking out of confessionals to bet their stipends. The hypocrisy was thick, you could butter bread with it. Now, here's where it gets juicy. Some Swiss towns decided to regulate the chaos, but instead of banning gambling outright, they just moved it behind closed doors. And guess who got in? Not the peasants. It was the merchants, the guild masters, the very same men who preached morality at dawn. Think of it like a medieval members-only casino, except the dress code was wool tunics and the jackpot was someone else's vineyard. And of course, wherever the dice rolled, so did the scandals of the flesh. Taverns doubled as brothels, gambling dens as pleasure houses. It was a package deal. Lose your purse, drown your shame in ale, and wake up to someone who definitely wasn't your spouse. If OnlyFans had existed, the Swiss would have franchised it by canton. One story tells of a Bernese captain who gambled away half his regiment's pay in Florence, then came home with more debts than dignity. The gossipers called him General Bankruptcy. Another tale described a merchant's wife who slipped notes under the dice table to her lover while her husband counted coins upstairs. It was basically the medieval version of texting under the dinner table. Foreigners, of course, loved it. Italian envoys wrote home that the Swiss are lions on the battlefield but lambs to temptation. French satirists joked that if Calvin ever returned to Geneva, he'd need a blackjack dealer's license. And the Germans? They invented a proverb: trust a Swiss with your life, but not with your wine, wife, or wager. The irony? Many Swiss councils tried to cover it up. Pamphlets were censored, tavern scandals hushed. But the more they tried to bury the stories, the juicier they became. Nothing sells faster than forbidden gossip. Imagine medieval TikTok, but instead of viral dancers, you had rhyming ballads about which councilman was caught with dice in one hand and a mistress in the other. By the late 16th century, gambling was so entwined with Swiss culture that reformers practically gave up. One pamphlet sighed, "We cannot separate the Swiss from their dice, no more than we can separate the Alps from their snow." Brutal honesty centuries before therapists. And what's the lesson here? That hypocrisy ages like fine cheese, stronger, smellier, and impossible to ignore. The Swiss may have marched in disciplined ranks, but their knights? They were rolling dice with the devil, and the devil usually won. So yes, the Swiss preached holiness by day, but when night fell, it wasn't psalms echoing in the valleys. It was dice, laughter, and scandal louder than church bells. So what do we make of it all? The Swiss Confederation built its image on discipline, faith, and alpine purity. But peel back the layers of sermons and statutes, and you find dice clattering louder than church bells, priests sneaking into chalets, guild masters turning taverns into casinos, and pamphlets roasting them all with savage glee. They wanted to be God's chosen guardians, yet their nights looked more like a medieval Netflix binge, half gambling, half gossip, and just enough hypocrisy to keep the pamphlet printers in business. And that's the delicious irony of history. The people who shouted loudest about virtue were often the ones rolling dice with vice. So yes, the Swiss gave Europe its most disciplined soldiers, but when it came to their bedrooms and their taverns, let's just say the Alps weren't the only things rising after dark. Stay tuned, because the next scandal makes this one look like child's play.